How does an equality law potentially cause discrimination? My name is Chris, and today we're going to discuss the 2010 Equality Act and how it potentially opens the door for discrimination against transgender, non-binary and asexual people. Stick around. So, before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Whenever looking at a source of legal commentary, it's important to understand the biases of the person setting out the argument. Because I want to make this easy, I'm going to outline my biases for you. First of all, I'm a trans woman. As you can imagine, this is going to colour my reading of the legislation, but it's also the source of my interest in it. Second, I'm currently a postgraduate law student at the University of Sunderland, and my research specialism is in trans rights, usually in regard to employment law and discrimination. So with that in mind, let's discuss the Equality Act 2010. The first thing you should know is that the Equality Act is primarily applicable to England, Scotland and Wales. Although some sections do cover Northern Ireland, there are a few differences in how equality law is applied over there, so do keep that in mind. The Equality Act was introduced in order to clarify which things should be covered by discrimination law. These are, in essence, a list of traits that people are born with and have often been the source of mistreatment in society. In the legislation, these are referred to as protected characteristics, and they go as follows: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. As I said in the intro, we're going to be talking about how the Equality Act potentially discriminates against trans, NB and ace communities, which means the characteristics we'll be focusing on will be gender reassignment, pregnancy and maternity, sex and sexual orientation. We'll cover all of these things, but before we do, I'd like to clarify what I mean when I say trans, NB and ace for those who might be confused by those terms. Trans or transgender refers to people who are, to varying degrees, transitioning from male to female, or at least from masculine to feminine, or vice versa. You might hear members of the community referred to or referring to themselves as trans men, trans women, trans masculine, or trans feminine. The easiest way to remember which applies to the person in question is that the men, women, masculine, feminine part of the term refers to the gender identity the person is transitioning to. NBs, or non-binary persons, are, depending on who you talk to, either considered a subsection of the trans community or a separate community in their own right. For the purposes of this, I'm going to deal with them separately because the law affects them in different ways. An NB is a person who doesn't identify as being either entirely or at all male or female. Because we know gender is a spectrum, which I'll talk about later, this community breaks down into further subcategories. For example, a gender-fluid person might describe themselves and present themselves as both masculine and feminine at different times, while an androgynous person might present as a blend of the two, or maybe neither. We'll also be including agender persons in this group, those who don't identify as having a gender, because the law affects them in the same way as NBs. Lastly, but by no means least, asexuals are those who don't experience sexual attraction to others. You might also encounter terms like grey or demi-grey attached, which means the person is primarily asexual but does occasionally experience sexual attraction. You'll usually find those terms attached to additional descriptors, such as heteroromantic, homoromantic, biromantic, panromantic, or aromantic, meaning that even if the person isn't sexually attracted to others, they might be romantically attracted to others or not romantically attracted to others at all, with the prefix meaning the same as it would if we were referring to the sexuality. With that out of the way, let's talk about sex. Sex is in the protected characteristic, not the act. Sorry. Under the Equality Act, you'll notice that sex and gender reassignment are both protected characteristics. As most of the enlightened modern generation understand, sex and gender are two entirely separate characteristics and concepts. Sex refers to biological sex, that of the body in which we're born, male or female. Contrary to the popular belief of the basic biology and sex and gender are the same thing crowd, sex is not a binary. It's actually a trinary. People are born either male, female, or intersex, which typically means the person has reproductive organs relating to both sexes, or the reproductive organs of one but develops through puberty into the other physically. Around 1% of the population is born intersex. You'll notice that gender, a person's identity within the confines of the gender spectrum, isn't defined as a protected characteristic. This is where our problems begin. Section 11A of the Equality Act states that in relation to the protected characteristic of sex, a reference to a person who has a particular characteristic is a reference to a man or a woman. This particular provision is clearly defined in a way that would lead any reasonable person to understand that it only applies to biological sex, yet some legal commentators will read them as meaning sex and gender interchangeably. However, if you identify as being an NB, this means that under the letter of the law, you aren't actually protected against discrimination. If someone finds the concept of you not identifying with their concept of gender or refusing to use non-gendered pronouns, it isn't entirely clear whether they're violating the law. This anti-discrimination law actually, in effect, discriminates against the non-binary community. But this lack of protection for gender as a separate class doesn't just affect our NB friends. This also affects the transgender community. If a trans person is discriminated against, it becomes a question of are they being discriminated against as a result of their biological sex, their gender, or their gender reassignment. We'll come on to gender reassignment in just a moment, but for just a second, let's talk hypotheticals. If a trans woman is discriminated against in the workplace, you have to determine whether they're being discriminated against for being born male, for being a woman, or because they transitioned from male to female. The first would be covered by sex, the second might be classed as gender rather than sex, and the third will be classified as gender reassignment. Now, the legislation doesn't really offer any guidance on this, and it's not out of the realms of possibility that this situation could arise. In the workplace, women typically earn substantially less than men. I'm not advocating for this, I'm just stating the facts. If an employer is paying a trans woman less than her male counterpart, could it be treated as sex discrimination, or is it discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment? Here's where it gets really sticky, because the law is based on intent and perception. If the employer has no idea that she's trans, and before any TERFs get excited, you can't always tell, then it is reasonable to assume that it's because she's a woman, which would make it sex discrimination. If the employer knows, you'd have to compare her wage to those of cisgender men and women in similar roles to try and deduce if the discrimination is based upon sex or gender reassignment. But what if the discrimination is merely based upon her gender identity as a woman? Well, that's when we have to look at the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Under Section 7 of the Equality Act, a person is protected under the characteristic of gender reassignment if, and I quote, the person is proposing to undergo, is undergoing, or has undergone a process or part of a process for reassigning the person's sex by changing physiological or other attributes of sex. This might seem wordy, and it is clarified in the guidance as, and I'm paraphrasing, but the link to the full act will be in the description below, someone who identifies as the opposite gender and presents that way is protected under the characteristic whether they choose to seek medical intervention or not, with some references made in there to passing. What isn't clear is where this protection begins, or if it applies to NBs. At the moment you tell your manager that you're transgender, are you covered? Are you only covered once you start presenting and living as that gender? What if you don't choose to present in a way that conforms to someone's gender stereotypes? What if you don't pass? Technically speaking, if a trans woman goes to her boss and says she'd like to be referred to as female, but continues showing up for work presented in a way that society considers masculine, is she protected under gender reassignment, or is that her gender identity, which isn't protected? Are NBs, who don't have a stereotypical gender presentation by definition, protected at all? I'm occasionally too lazy to shave. If I don't, does that mean I'm no longer protected, given that a beard is a stereotypically male characteristic? Talking of identities, let's discuss sexual orientation. Under Section 12 of the Act, it states sexual orientation means a person's sexual orientation towards persons of the same sex, the opposite sex, or both sexes. To my reading, that very clearly states that you can only be discriminated against if you experience sexual attraction to others. For clarity, I'm presuming that both sexes it covers pansexuals and includes intersex persons. Does this mean you can be discriminated against if you don't experience sexual attraction at all? Here's the good news. Probably not, because I think you'd be able to make the argument that it was of equal validity. However, I can't guarantee it, because, to the best of my knowledge, this has never been tested in court. The final thing I'm going to talk about is pregnancy and maternity, specifically relating to the trans and NB communities, and this will bring us full circle back to the gender discussion. Let's start with the basic biology lesson for the basic biology crowd. At the time of this recording, and who knows, it might change one day, only biological women can become pregnant. The key word there is biological. For those who are confused by this, there are biological women who, for whatever reason, can't become pregnant, and trans women can't become pregnant. The ability to incubate biological offspring does not define womanhood. Here's where it affects the trans and non-binary communities. Trans men and NBs born biologically female can get pregnant, at least up until a certain stage in medical transition and notwithstanding any other medical influences. So let's look at Section 17 of the Equality Act. A person discriminates against a woman if they treat her unfavourably because of a pregnancy of hers. Well, we know we have to be referring to a biological female because pregnancy is involved. But what if said biological female is a trans man? Trans men can and have gotten pregnant and given birth, but would never refer to themselves as a woman or using feminine pronouns. Are they protected against being treated unfavourably? If someone comments negatively on it inside or outside the workplace, are they discriminating on the basis of sex, gender reassignment, or pregnancy? Is there any legal recourse for them if they are discriminated against? After all, the law clearly states that a woman cannot be treated unfavourably due to pregnancy. This, by extension, means you can't treat a woman, biological or trans, unfavourably because of their inability to have children or lack of desire to have children. As with most of my examples so far, these discussion points remain largely hypothetical and have had, at best, limited testing in court. But they're legal points that will be tested in the future, and it's important that we understand where we stand on these points now. So, how do we fix this? Well, honestly, this legislation just needs a reform to effectively redraft the language. Add gender identity as a protected characteristic, and you've removed all doubt. Replace woman in the pregnancy protections in favour of person. Now, before anyone gets excited, I'm not erasing women. Sit down. We need to clearly define the terms of sex and gender in the appendices of the legislation, as well as clarifying the exact stage at which someone can be said to have commenced gender reassignment. Oh, and removing the requirement to live or present as an outdated stereotype, and acknowledge the presence of MBs and ACEs. That's all it takes, because for now, not everybody is included in the Equality Act, and that's how discrimination legislation causes discrimination. Links to my sources are in the description below. If an argument doesn't have a corresponding source, it's safe to assume that I'm the source of the argument. Don't forget to like and subscribe, ring the bell so you get notifications whenever a new video pops up, and let's get a discussion going in the comments. Remember though, please, be kind. This is a place of love, not hate. We're here to discuss the law. We're not here to discuss your politics. And until next time, I've been Chris, and I'll see you very soon. Take care.